It was the first Tuesday in February, and my wife and I's plans for the evening were to attend our second last prenatal class. My wife was 33 weeks pregnant at the time. It was our first pregnancy, and she had been told a couple weeks earlier that her blood pressure was a little higher than they wanted it to be. So the decision was made to have my wife stop working, rest at home, and hopefully bring her blood pressure under control. However, at a subsequent doctor's appointment that same morning, we discovered that her blood pressure was still higher yet. So the doctor made the next step and said, you know what, I think we need to admit your wife for observation for a few days, just to get this blood pressure under control. So with that information, we made our way home, packed a bag, grabbed a bite to eat, got Julie checked into the hospital, and then went down to check out our second last prenatal class. As this was our first pregnancy, we didn't want to miss anything. We didn't know yet that, sort of like Teachers College for educators, I guess, that prenatal class maybe doesn't prepare you for everything that you're going to find out in the real world. So about halfway through the class, Julie began to feel not very good, a little ill. We spoke to our instructor at halftime, we explained Julie's situation, and we excused ourselves for the second half of our prenatal class. We made our way up to Julie's room. She was going to rest. I was going to stay with her until she fell asleep and then head home for the rest of the evening. However, shortly after that, she became even more ill. She began throwing up, actually. Now, thankfully, we were in a hospital, so there was lots of people to help. Not my specialty. However, at 11:30 p.m., Julie's water broke. And there's perhaps one other detail about our pregnancy that you should know. Not only was Julie 33 weeks pregnant, it was our first pregnancy, we were also expecting twins. So we were now in the middle of what's called a premature multiple birth delivery. The on-call medical staff then had to make the decision, is this something that we would handle at the hospital that we were already in, or would Julie be airlifted by ambulance to the nearest hospital that specialized in premature multiple birth deliveries? Well, given how far along Julie was, the decision was made to stay where we were, and that's what we did. And at 2:16 and 2:19 a.m., early that morning, we welcomed our beautiful twin daughters, beautiful, healthy, but skinny, very scrawny, into the world, Brooklyn and Catherine. They weighed 4 pounds 4 ounces and 4 pounds 6 ounces, respectively. And for the next month, we enjoyed firsthand the quality medical care provided by the staff at the neonatal intensive care unit. The girls were kept warm in a shared isolette. They were fed via tube till they were strong enough to nurse. And we learned how to care for them, how to change them, how to feed them, and everything that we needed to know. And an important part of our daily routine was something called kangaroo care. Now, kangaroo care involved each of us getting one of the girls. They just had their diaper on at that point. We would open up our hospital gown, lay them on our chest, skin to skin, wrap the gown back up, wrap ourselves in a blanket, sit in a rocking chair, and just hold them for an hour or 90 minutes or so. We might read to them, or sing to them, or maybe just hold them as they slept. And we learned this kangaroo care therapy was important because while the girls had all the technology they needed, they were kept warm in their shared isolettes, they were being fed by tubes as they became strong enough to nurse, clean diapers, clean sheets, all those things. They needed more than that. They needed to know they belonged. They needed to know they were part of something bigger than themselves. They needed to know they were loved, they were cared for, and they needed to know that someone put their interests ahead of their own. I believe that everyone needs to know that they belong. And I believe anyone who wishes to be a leader and take anything to the next level needs to understand that one of the things that you need to do is build community and build relationships. And I want to talk to you this morning about the importance of building community in a high-tech world. Let's drill down a little deeper into this need for human belonging and how we understand it. For the last 75 years or so, our understanding of belonging and how it fits into the sort of pyramid of human behavior, if you will, has been framed by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs was written in the early 1940s, after the Great Depression and in the middle of the First World War. And if you're not familiar with it, I'll explain it to you quickly. Basically, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is the progression of human needs, and he explains human behavior in that we will seek to meet the needs at the base of the pyramid and then move through to the top. So at the base of the pyramid, Maslow would put physiological needs like food and water, followed by safety and security, belonging in the middle, self-esteem, and then finally self-actualization at the top. One of the ways to think about this, for example, would be to think about the actions of the TV contestants on the show Survivor. You know, they need to stab a fish, build a fire, find shelter, form alliances, develop their in-game persona, and then hopefully have enough votes at the end of the game to win. So with this understanding of Maslow, I would suggest that for people today, and especially young people today, that we can actually rethink Maslow's hierarchy of needs and even perhaps start to begin about thinking about having belonging at the base of the pyramid. We live in a day and age where people aren't scrounging for food and water. We're more safe and secure than ever. Yet the next generation does not belong, does not feel connected to their community. That next generation, the so-called I generation, as written about by Dr. Jean Twenge, she feels that this generation, the ones that have been raised with smartphones, has spent more hours on screens, more hours on social media than any other generation before them, yet they feel strangely disconnected from the world in which they live. Sort of like our twins in the prenatal care unit, they had the technology they needed to live, but they lacked the connection to be truly alive. Now, this begs the question, why is there this decline in belonging? Why do people today not feel as connected as they did before? I work in education, and I know one of the things that I struggle with as I continue on in my career longer is finding references in popular culture that everyone can relate to. I call this the popular culture illusion gap. So what can I use as something from popular culture to explain to students today that I also understand and the generations in between understand, or something that we would all understand? It used to be easy. We would probably just talk about the TV show that we watched the night before. However, today that's not quite so simple. YouTube, of course, started in 2005. In the first 5 years, there were 5 YouTube channels that had 1 million subscribers. In 2015, 1,000 YouTube channels had 1 million subscribers, and now in 2018, there are over 5,000 so-called YouTube millionaires, with new 1 million subscriber channels being added at the rate of 5 every day. Netflix changed its method of delivering content from mailing DVDs to streaming content online about 10 years ago. 5 years after that, they had 40 million subscribers worldwide. Today, they have 125 million subscribers worldwide. I know our teenage son Jackson and our daughters Brooklyn and Catherine are far more likely to watch their content online by themselves on their screen rather than sit around the flat screen TV with mom and dad. We think we're high tech because we're fast forwarding commercials on our digital PVR, which of course is much easier to program than the old VCR, which some of you will only ever see in a museum. So what are people watching then? Well, they're of course binge watching things on Netflix and on YouTube, but on television, reality TV was thought to be the next big thing. And I was one of them. I was one of the 50 million people who tuned in to watch Richard Hatch win season 1 of Survivor in the year 2000. However, only 7 million people tuned in to watch the winner of Survivor season 36, which is the most recent one that just ended. Now, of course, this trend makes my explanation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, based on the TV show Survivor, far less relevant to this audience here today. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about the popular culture illusion gap. Something else we can use to illustrate this is the loss of impact of the so-called cliffhanger. That used to be what TV shows used to make people watch. Probably the biggest cliffhanger of all time was the Who Shot JR cliffhanger, which was part of the primetime soap opera Dallas. This cliffhanger was resolved in 1980 with 80 million viewers watch that episode. That's more people than voted in the US presidential election, which was held the same year. Now, by contrast, the most recent cable TV cliffhanger, perhaps who was killed by Negan and his baseball bat Lucille in the TV show Walking Dead, which was resolved 2 years ago, 17 million people tuned in to watch the resolution of that cliffhanger. That's less than a quarter of the people who tuned in to watch Who Shot JR. So what do people watch? Well, what TV channels pay big money for now is sports. Sports are the big deal. The current NFL contract is worth nearly $30 billion. Each of the 32 teams in the NFL gets $200 million per season before a single ball is snapped or a single jersey is sold. 110 million of us watched the last Super Bowl live. The March Madness college basketball tournament brings the NCAA $1 billion per year for 3 weekends of live TV sports programming. Now, why are people tuning in to watch live sports? Well, I would suggest to you it's because live sports present a common experience. It's something that we're going through at the same time. It's something you can talk about the next day. I believe that belonging comes from relationships, and relationships come from common experiences. So the next day at school or at work, you can't talk about what show you just watched because most people are watching different shows, and even the people watching the same show as you are probably watching it on Netflix or on a different season, and you don't want to spoil it for them, and they don't want to spoil it for you. So instead, we talk about sports. In fact, the last great so-called water cooler show that people would talk about at work or at school the next day was probably Seinfeld. Seinfeld, of course, famous for bringing us such phrases as yada, 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 no soup for you, Festivus for the rest of us, and regifting. Seinfeld was once, of course, master of his own domain. The farewell episode of Seinfeld, which aired in 1998, is the most recent show in the top 100 list of all TV shows watched all time. So there hasn't been a show in the last 20 years that anybody's watched as much as the final episode of Seinfeld. And the fact is, I looked out into the audience today that maybe only half of you even got those 6 Seinfeld references that I included in that sentence, is further evidence of this so-called popular culture illusion gap. Now, clearly, there must be more to it than just we're not watching the same TV shows, and of course there is. There's 4 major trends that I would also say have contributed to this lack of belonging that we see in society today. Those trends would be an increase in individualism, bordering on narcissism, to be honest, a rise of secularization, the proliferation of the smartphone and social media, and of course the explosion of choice that has come with that. You can maybe rephrase those 4 trends in the following way. My rights and happiness matter most. I am my own moral compass. My life is on display for all to see and is being compared to everyone else's. And lastly, what I want, I get, and I can pretty much get it instantly. The unintended consequence of all these trends together has been a loosening of the bonds that hold us all in common. It has led to loneliness, isolation, increases in anxiety and despair. People long to belong, period. And for my wife and I, it was easy to understand who it was that needed our belonging focus. And I'm going to come back to that, because I think it's important that once we understand that people need to belong, well, we need to then figure out, well, what can we do as leaders to develop a sense of belonging? What can we do to build a community where people belong and take things to the next level? I would say there are 2 approaches to this. The first one, favored by Dr. Brené Brown in her most recent book, Braving the Wilderness, where she powerfully writes about the processes that an individual can take to build their own sense of belonging. The second approach, which I want to talk to you about today in conclusion, is what practices that we can foster to promote a sense of belonging in the people that we come in contact with every day. And those 4 practices are to be loving, optimistic, noble, and generous. So the 4 practices that we can foster to promote belonging in the communities around us is to be loving, optimistic, noble, and generous. And some of you may have seen what I did there. First of all, let's start with loving. A simple definition of love is to put the interests of someone else ahead of your own. In leadership language, we would call this servant leadership. It's not about you. The idea of putting other people first and loving other people is very important. Using titles and counting on authority to get things done today just doesn't move people. However, we may not all do great things, but as Mother Teresa said, we can do small things with great love. We can be optimistic. Well, to be optimistic simply means to look on the bright side of things. How much time and energy do we spend worrying about things that never happen? Being an optimist means believing the best intent about people and about circumstances. Optimism leads to happiness. Happiness draws people in. People are attracted to happiness, and it builds belonging. Next, we can be noble. Noble is a word that maybe isn't used as much these days. I think it's an important word, not just because I needed an N for the acronym, but also because to be noble to me means to be heroic, to take the high road in a situation, to maybe squelch a rumor instead of spreading it, to maybe build someone up instead of tear them down, to maybe stop and offer assistance instead of walking by. And last, we want to be generous. I think it's more important than ever today to be generous, not just with our finances and our resources, but even more importantly, to be generous with our time and our attention. We quite often don't see material deficits in our lives today as so much, but we see a lot of meaningful connection deficits. And being generous with your time and attention shows people that they matter, and that builds a sense of belonging. As I said earlier, it was easy for my wife and I to understand who it was that needed our relationship focus, who needed our love, optimism, nobility, and generosity. It was our 33-week-old premature twin daughters. I want to challenge you for a moment today to think about the 33-week-old preemies in your life. Think about people maybe in your school, in your community, in your place of work, maybe even in your own home, who are lonely and isolated, who long to belong, who are waiting for someone to maybe step out of their comfort zone, exhibit some kangaroo care, Show them that they matter. Show them that you're willing to place their interests ahead of your own. The next generation, indeed all of us, long to belong, period. And whatever plans you might have to take your leadership to the next level will depend on building a foundation where people belong. Remember, the biggest ship in leadership is relationship. The next generation, indeed all of us, long to belong, and that is an idea worth spreading. Thank you.